don't say it out loud. They don't need to. You see it in their eyes when you talk about starting now, when you say you're still becoming something, when you admit you're not where you thought you'd be. There's a pause, a half smile, a silence that answers before words ever do. You're late, not late to the meeting, late to life. You feel it when birthdays pass quietly, when accomplishments belong to other people, when the world seems to reward those who arrived early, loudly, confidently, while you were still figuring out who you were. And slowly, without noticing, you start agreeing with them. You tell yourself you missed your window. That momentum belongs to the young. That reinvention is risky now. That you should settle, not build. This is not humility. It's programming. Because here's the truth most people never stop long enough to confront. The idea that life rewards speed is not wisdom. It's marketing. We live in a culture that worships acceleration, faster success, earlier recognition, instant proof. If you don't make it quickly, the system treats you like an expired product. But look closer. Speed creates visibility, not durability. The people who rise fast often rise hollow. They confuse motion with direction, applause with alignment. They sprint toward goals they didn't choose, and spend the rest of their lives trying to outrun the emptiness that follows. You didn't sprint. You paused. You questioned. You got lost, and because of that, they think you're behind. But what if being late isn't a flaw? What if it's a filter? Early winners learn how to perform. Late starters learn how to see. They study patterns while others chase noise. They notice cycles while others chase moments. They endure invisibility while others burn themselves out trying to stay seen. That's not failure. That's preparation. The world applauds those who arrive early because it doesn't know how to measure depth. It only knows how to count speed, but depth is invisible until it isn't. Think about it. Most people don't fail because they lack talent. They fail because they commit to the wrong life too early. They choose identities before understanding themselves. They lock into paths before they've questioned why they're walking them. By the time doubt arrives, they're trapped by momentum, mortgages, reputations, expectations. They're early and stuck. You were late because you resisted becoming someone you weren't ready to be. That resistance looked like delay, but it was discernment. You didn't avoid effort, you avoided false certainty, and that matters more than you realize, because clarity doesn't come from speed. It comes from friction. It comes from watching plans fail, from sitting with disappointment, from learning the difference between what impresses people and what actually sustains you. That kind of clarity cannot be rushed. It only arrives after illusions collapse. And that's why the late ones are dangerous. They don't need approval to move. They don't need permission to begin. They don't need validation to endure uncertainty. They've already lived without applause. So when they finally act, they don't hesitate. They choose better battles. They waste less energy. They don't chase doors. They notice openings no one else was patient enough to see. Most people fear starting late because they think time is against them. But time is not your enemy. Time exposes the fragile and strengthens the grounded. What rises fast often falls fast. What takes longer to build takes longer to break. You weren't behind. You were hardening. While others were polishing an image, you were learning resilience. While others were curating success, you were absorbing reality. While others were collecting praise, you were collecting information. And information compounds quietly. There's a reason the most stable structures aren't assembled quickly. They're layered, tested, reinforced. No one applauds the foundation, but everything depends on it. The shame you carry about starting late was never yours to begin with. It was handed to you by a culture terrified of stillness, because stillness reveals things speed tries to hide. It reveals misalignment. It reveals false goals. It reveals who you are without noise. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That's why the world pressures you to move fast, before you think too deeply, before you ask better questions, before you choose differently. You didn't move fast. You waited until the noise stopped working. And now something uncomfortable is happening. You're no longer distracted enough to lie to yourself. That discomfort isn't failure. It's the moment before alignment. You feel it as restlessness, as quiet urgency, as the sense that something is loading beneath the surface, not panic, pressure. Only scares people who haven't been forged. You have. Which is why this isn't a comeback story. Comebacks depend on recognition. This doesn't. This is an arrival into clarity, into restraint, into deliberate power. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your timing. But you do owe yourself a decision. Stay trapped in comparison, or step into the advantage your delay has been quietly building. Because when late starters finally move, they don't rush, they arrive, and in the next session will break the first illusion that keeps people stuck forever. The belief that time is something you've lost instead of something you can command. The most dangerous lie about time isn't that you're late, it's that time only moves in one direction. Forward, away from you, leaving you behind. That belief quietly controls everything. Your confidence, your risk tolerance, your willingness to begin. You don't hesitate because you lack ability. You hesitate because you think the clock is judging you. But time doesn't judge. People do. Clocks don't measure readiness. They measure repetition. And repetition is where power is built. Most people treat time like a deadline, something they're racing against, something they're losing. That's why they panic start things they don't understand. That's why they cling to paths that no longer fit. That's why they confuse movement with meaning. But there's another way to understand time, one the loud world never teaches. Time doesn't reward speed, it rewards leverage. Leverage comes from accumulation, experience stacked on experience, mistakes turned into pattern recognition, failures converted into instruction. This is why two people can live the same number of years and emerge completely different. One repeats the same year over and over, calling it a life. The other compounds. You didn't waste years, you invested them. Even if you didn't know it at the time, every disappointment trained you, every delay refined you, every season of invisibility stripped away illusions. You weren't idle, you were incubating. The problem is, the world only recognizes visible growth. Titles, money, applause, but the most decisive growth happens underground. Roots don't grow where everyone can see them. Yet without roots, nothing stands. This is why people who peak early often collapse later. They grow upward before they grow deep. And when pressure comes, real pressure, there's nothing underneath to hold them steady. You're different. Pressure didn't destroy you. It taught you restraint. You learned when to move and when to wait, when to speak and when silence was stronger. When chasing was wasteful and stillness was strategic. That kind of discipline only comes from time, not calendar time, lived time, time that costs you something. This is where the illusion breaks. You don't need more time. You need to use the time you already contain. Because time isn't just something outside you, it's stored inside you as judgment, intuition, and clarity. Think about it. When you were younger, how many choices did you make just to be seen? Just to fit? Just to keep up? Now compare that to how you decide today. You move slower, but cleaner. You say no faster, and mean it. You don't chase everything, only what aligns. That's not aging, that's sharpening. This is why starting late is often starting correctly. You're no longer hypnotized by urgency. You're not seduced by shortcuts. You don't confuse excitement with direction. You see through the traps because you've already been caught by a few. And once you've seen the pattern, you can't unsee it. The world wants you rushed. Rushed people are predictable. They're easy to sell to, easy to pressure, easy to control. But someone who has waited, truly waited, becomes hard to manipulate. They don't jump because others jump. They don't panic because others panic. They don't abandon themselves for approval. They move with internal authority. That's the real advantage of starting late. You're no longer living on borrowed urgency. You're operating on chosen intent. This is why comparison feels weaker now. Why envy doesn't hit the same way. Why other people's timelines no longer hypnotize you. Your nervous system has matured. You can hold uncertainty without collapsing. You can sit in silence without distraction. You can plan long without needing constant reassurance. Most people never develop this capacity. They're too busy performing success to cultivate stability. But stability is what survives pressure, and pressure is the only environment where real power shows itself. Late starters don't need to prove themselves quickly. They don't need to impress everyone. They only need to move once, correctly. One aligned move outweighs 10 frantic ones. One deliberate decision saves years of correction. This is why, when late bloomers finally commit, it looks effortless from the outside. People say, it just worked out for them. They didn't see the decade of internal calibration. They didn't see the restraint, the observation, the refusal to settle for a life that looked good but felt wrong. That refusal is rare, and rarity is power. But there's a final shift that has to happen because many people get this far and still stall. They understand the idea. They feel the readiness, but they keep waiting for permission, not from others, from themselves. In the next session, we'll confront the final internal barrier, the voice that keeps asking, who am I to do this now? We'll dismantle it. We'll replace hesitation with internal command. And we'll talk about the one environment shift that determines whether this transformation holds or quietly dies. Because clarity without action is just another form of delay. And you didn't come this far to stay almost ready. If this session resonated, subscribe, not for motivation, but because what comes next is where identity actually changes. There is one last obstacle that stops people who are finally ready. Not fear, not doubt, not even failure. It's familiarity. You don't stay stuck because you can't move. You stay stuck because your old identity still feels safer than your future one, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Your mind doesn't ask, is this life fulfilling? It asks, is this life familiar? And familiarity feels like survival. That's why people return to the same patterns, the same conversations, the same self-doubt, the same explanations. They call it realism, but realism is often just loyalty to an outdated version of yourself. You've outgrown who you were, and that's uncomfortable because the old you had rules, limits, excuses that worked. The new you doesn't. The new you is undefined, and undefined feels dangerous. So your mind tries to pull you back. It whispers things like, at least you know who you are here. At least people expect this version. At least you won't embarrass yourself. This isn't intuition, it's inertia. Most people never cross this line. They circle readiness for years, calling it patience, calling it timing, calling it waiting for clarity. But clarity has already arrived. What you're really waiting for is permission to disappoint the old version of yourself. And that's the moment that changes everything. Because the greatest risk is not failing at something new. The greatest risk is succeeding at a life that no longer belongs to you. This is where most transformations die, quietly, not with collapse, but with compromise. People tell themselves they'll start soon, when things calm down, when they feel more confident, when they're more ready. But readiness is not a feeling, it's a decision. And decisions don't arrive gently. They interrupt. They disrupt routines. They break agreements you never realized you were living under. That's why the moment you decide to move differently, resistance appears. Old relationships feel heavier. Old environments feel louder. Old habits feel suffocating. Nothing changed except you. And when you change, the contrast becomes unbearable. This is not a sign you're wrong. It's a sign you're no longer anesthetized. Your nervous system is waking up. You're starting to feel when something drains you instead of fuels you, when something shrinks you instead of strengthens you. And once you feel that, you cannot go back to pretending. This is where boundaries are born, not aggressive boundaries, not dramatic ones, quiet ones. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop negotiating with voices that only know your past. You stop volunteering for environments that punish growth. This isn't arrogance, it's alignment. You're no longer trying to be accepted by people who benefited from you staying the same. And yes, some will be uncomfortable, some will joke, some will question, some will subtly discourage, not because you're wrong, but because your change forces them to confront their own stagnation. Your movement threatens their comfort, so they'll call it risky, unnecessary, late. Let them. You already know what staying costs you. You've paid that price for years. This is the shift no one talks about. When you stop identifying as someone who is becoming and start identifying as someone who chooses. Choosing doesn't require permission, it requires ownership. Ownership of your time, your energy, your direction. Ownership means you stop waiting to feel confident and start acting with commitment. Confidence follows action, not the other way around. This is why people who finally move later in life don't hesitate the way others do. They don't need proof anymore. They've already proven what doesn't work. They're not experimenting with identity. They're executing alignment. And when alignment meets action, something rare happens. Noise disappears. You stop caring how it looks. You stop asking how it will be perceived. You stop measuring yourself against people playing a different game. You become internally referenced. That's real freedom. Not freedom from responsibility. Freedom from false obligation. You don't rush anymore. You don't stall anymore. You move when it's time because you can feel when it's time. And that ability is earned. It only comes to those who waited long enough to hear themselves clearly. So if you're standing at that edge right now, between who you were and who you're ready to be, understand this. Nothing is missing. You don't need more motivation. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need approval. You need to stop living as if your past deserves veto power over your future. The years you thought were lost were not wasted. They stripped you down. They sharpened your discernment. They removed your appetite for shallow lives. You are not late. You are precise. And precision is what lasts. If this journey reflected something you felt but never heard articulated, comment the one word that describes where you are right now. Not where you've been. Not where you're going. Where you are. That's how this chapter ends, and how the next one begins.